Hello, everybody. Okay, well, here we are again, week 3 of online learning. It's a nice, gorgeous, wonderful, snowy day in April. Awesome. So here we are inside and getting ready to move on with our talks. I hope that everything's going okay. I haven't heard from some people about if the studio thing worked on the Canvas system. I think it did. I'm hoping that it did. And I'm hoping that you guys were able to watch the last 2 episodes from last week. Okay? If there's any problems, make sure and contact me. I don't know if there's a problem if you don't tell me. So, yeah. So we're just going to continue doing what we're doing. As you guys know by now, you should be getting started on your final project. Remember, it's both a video and a paper component to that project. It is usually, I've done in the past, group work, but since we can't do groups anymore, you're on your own with it. But you have a month to do it, so plenty of time to get it done. Make sure that you look at the requirement sheet over and over and over again so that you don't leave anything out, and have fun with it. I think it'll be a good time since everything's all online and done remotely now. Might as well do what you can with it and be inventive. Use your imagination and have a good time with it. Okay? Okay, so we're gonna get started today. So last week we talked about we moved from like the Dark Ages, the beginnings of medieval Europe, and we went and we started talking about how these tribal confederations, right, like the Franks and the Vandals and all these other groups, how over hundreds and hundreds of years they slowly went from this idea of just like barbarian tribes to people that were now in these areas in Europe. That's where generations and generations previous, their ancestors had arrived through migration into the Roman Empire, and this is where they were. And so last week we were talking about the creation of what? Of identity. What did it mean to be a person here in this piece or part of the world compared to this other person on the part of the world? We talked about medieval society, right? About that identity, that how this concept permeates throughout all of society. It doesn't matter where you are in Europe. And our focus is on Central and Western Europe, okay, for the most part. It doesn't matter where you are here. What matters is that leading up to the year 1000 and onward, these people are developing a sense of who they are. They're developing a sense of themselves. And even though a peasant in a typical life of a peasant is not going far away from where they were born and where they live, there's still this concept by the year 1000, give or take, whatever, 100 years on either side, of who you are. That the language you speak is different from some traveler who comes through. Even if that person kind of speaks the same language as you, there's a little bit difference there. That the way you do your festivals, the way your traditions are, you have a connection with the people around you. But you don't have a connection with you don't have that same connection with people that, if I took a person and I dropped them 300 miles away in a totally different kingdom, there'd be differences, obviously, the way they dress, the way they act. But there are some connections that we talked about, right? Especially like the lives of the peasantry, the lives of the little people. If you're raising a pig in Germany, you're doing the same thing in France. You're doing the same thing in England. It stands to reason that these people would have some things in common. And what's the biggest thing they have in common? Christianity, right? Christianity. But at this time, Christianity is still fighting, like we talked about, with superstition and even a little bit of paganism. And it will be Christianity's eventual march towards supremacy. The Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church's march towards supremacy which will try and get rid of any last vestiges of paganism or superstition. But we did mention that superstition in little dribs and drabs lasts for a very long time. But for the most part, the church reigns supreme. Okay, the church in Rome reigns supreme. We also talked about last week how, like, after you have the disintegration of the Carolingian Empire and the formation of the Holy Roman Empire, that these nobles are kind of almost like kings to themselves. They owe allegiance, right, to the king, wherever they may be, but to a large degree, they kind of have an autonomy amongst themselves. The king might be far away, probably is far away, and so if you're one of his high-ranking nobles, you kind of run things the way you want to run things in your neck of the woods. And we talked about the rise of a couple different things, such as like fealty, right? Offering your fealty to a person higher up. So if like you're a duke, you offer your fealty to the king. If you're a count, you offer your fealty to the duke, and so on. We also talked about the term homage, right? That you pay homage to that person. And it's a tit for tat. It's a working relationship. The king grants you title and grants you land. And then in return, you are expected to pay him taxes, and you're expected to support him with troops. Because remember, there's no standing armies or anything like that. The troops that he has come from you. He has some troops, but for the most part, the troops, the armies that he has, come from you and the other high-ranking nobles. And everything goes, flows from the bottom to the top, okay? The people at the top don't do much. The people at the bottom do everything, okay? Remember, it's like the pyramid thing. At the very bottom, there's like 99% just regular people, just the peasantry doing their thing. At the very top, you have the church and you have the nobility. We also see the rise of the knighthood, and with that chivalry, because remember, this is still a very brutal time period. People are just running around killing each other, stealing, taking. The life of a peasant is could end at any point really quickly, because of how brutal the Middle Ages were, even these high Middle Ages. They're getting progressively better, but they're still very, we would look at the society as almost being lawless to a large degree, because there's no police force, there's no real centralized government, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. But the church, in coordination with many of the people, the local officials, work on, remember, the truce and pact of God, and they try and force these knights, the lowest ranking nobles, to do what Christianity has taught them to do, which is be a good person. You're a warrior. Remember, a knight is a warrior. But with the truce and pact of God, the idea is now to switch the sheer brutality of these knights running around just doing their thing, to making them a warrior of God. To making them a foot soldier for the army of Christ. And then they try and institute rules, and those rules are called chivalry, right? That if if you're fighting a guy and he's at the same rank as you, you don't just slaughter him. You take him prisoner, and you offer him a ransom for his return to his family and everything else. When you go into a village, obviously you kill everybody in the village because you are a trained professional soldier. But you don't just take, and you don't just do awful things just because you can, because that's not what Christ was professing 1,000 years before. Christ was saying, turn the other cheek. Well, these guys are warriors, so they're not going to sit there and hold hands with each other out in the battlefield. They're going to kill. And so the church and their masters, the higher nobles, are going to have to find ways of using their expertise in warfare to focus it on a common enemy. And that common enemy in the Middle Ages for any Christian living in Europe are the Muslims, okay? The rise of Islam, okay, down here in the south, and as we have talked about, creeping up into Europe itself, okay? So moving on. Today, your guiding question is, how did the mixture of church authority and kingship lead to the formation of centralized government in medieval Europe? Okay, so once again, how did the mixture of church authority and kingship lead to the formation of centralized government in medieval Europe? Okay, How do we go from being the king has no power and he's answering to his nobles and hoping that the nobles keep him around, to all of a sudden, you know, after a couple generations, the king starts getting power, and now we see actual kingdoms, like it says up here on the map, you know, like France and England and Holy Roman Empire, and these little ones here that will eventually coalesce into Spain, and so on. How do we slowly start to get to that centralized government where here's the king, here's his ministers, here's the power, and the power emanates like, you know, the inside of a wheel, and it emanates out through the spokes, to the whole area. Okay, how does that happen? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, all right. And to do that, to start off, we're going to take a little tour around Europe, around Central and Western Europe. We're going to hit each one of these 4 areas here, or 5 areas, as we go around and talk about that concept. Okay, all right. So here we go. Okay, so our little tour starts up here in England, and we talked last week about, you know, where that name comes from, right? Because the 2 original groups that settled there after the Romans took off in the 5th century were the Angles and the Saxons, right? The Angles and the Saxons were barbarian tribes that originated up here in what is now northern Germany and the Low Countries, and they immigrated, well, forcibly immigrated and invaded England itself, okay? And then they settled there. And then eventually the people there started forming this common identity of who they were, okay? Till we get to the year around 800, okay? Whoops. Till we get to around the year 800, and we have a hodgepodge of kingdoms here in what are the British Isles, okay? Over here we have Ireland, and up here Pictland, or another name for Scotland, okay? The Welsh over here in the west, and then you have the Northern Kingdom, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, Sussex, and Essex, okay? These names are based off of their geographic locations, obviously. So Northumbria is in the north, Mercia is in the middle, East Anglia is east, Wessex is in the west, Essex is in the east. Are you see where we're going here? And Sussex is in the south. Okay, so by the year 800, this is what it looks like. And we talked about a new group that showed up, right? Because all these little proto-kingdoms are dealing with invasions, okay? And the big invasion with the English Isles here is the invasion of the Northmen, right? The Vikings. And the Angles and the Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons, had no real answer for them. Eventually, the Vikings took over most of this, and only Wessex was really the last kingdom left there. They formed kind of an uneasy truce that lasted for many generations. And we talked about this a little bit last week. How did they eventually defeat the Vikings? Well, they did not defeat the Vikings in battle. There was no grand reconquest of the British Isles against the Vikings, because remember, the Vikings first show up as raiders and pillagers, but then eventually, after a couple decades, they start bringing their families. Well, you don't bring your families to just as a neat, fun trip. You bring them to settle, and that's what they did. And they settled here, and eventually Vikings, Northmen from Scandinavia settle here. They start intermarrying with local girls and things like that. And then pretty soon you have now mixed families, okay? You have families that can trace their lineage back to the original Anglo-Saxons, and then you have people that can trace their lineage back to the Vikings as well. So what eventually stops them? What eventually gets rid of the Vikings? Like I said, there's no grand battle, there's no reconquest. Settlement and Christianity finally do away with the Vikings as they are. Okay, there are no more. Eventually, there are no more Vikings. There's no more. It doesn't mean that piracy or stuff like that goes away. It just means that as an event in history, the Viking invasions in the West, at least, by the time you get to the year 900, a little bit before that, you start getting, well, the Vikings have settled down and they've become just like the people that they conquered. Now all of a sudden, instead of, reavers and fighters, they're now, well, farmers or tradesmen or people living in a city, doing the things in a city, doing what they need to do. And so eventually, just decade after decade of this, we see that people just settle down. That's what they do. They just settle down. And then you have children, and your children, are taught a trade, and then their children are taught a trade, and so on. Okay, the idea of jumping onto a ship and pillaging around the Europe, well, it starts to get a little bit, old. When you can just have a life somewhere. Doesn't mean the Vikings go away completely. There's still Vikings running around doing their thing around Europe, but the great Viking invasions, for the most part, drift off and tail off, okay? Then we also talked about this. So by the time we get to the 11th century, so the 1000s, we see that these kingdoms have formed. The English, right, kingdom has formed to a large degree. And so that's 200 years after this map, okay? So now this is slowly starting to form into an English kingdom, okay? But they still have the old remnants of their old Viking past, their Viking Anglo-Saxon past. And we talked a little bit about this thing that you're looking up here. This is a huge tapestry, remember, called the Bayeux Tapestry, okay? It was produced in France, in northern France, and it's about a guy from northern France and his army. So this tells the tale about William of Normandy, or William the Bastard, or as he is later called, William the Conqueror, okay? He is the Duke of Normandy, right there in the top part of France, and he has been promised the English throne by the previous king. The previous king dies without issue, so he dies without children, but on his deathbed, he takes back his promise to William, and he gives it to another nobleman, okay? He gives it to another nobleman, and that nobleman's name is Harold Godwinson. You don't need to know his name, but I'll tell you anyway, okay? Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson, you do need to know this, is the equivalent of a count in Europe. So, but his title is Earl. So in England, they don't, at the beginning, they don't really have what's called a count, right? A lower level nobleman, but they take from the Vikings one of their terms, one of their titles, and in Scandinavian, the term Jarl, J-A-R-L, means chief. So you'd be following a war chieftain, okay, a Jarl. Well, as these Jarls start settling in England, the language changes and moves over time, and this word slowly becomes Earl or Jarl, and then eventually now we know it as Earl, E-A-R-L. Okay, so one of these most prominent earls, Harold Godwinson, he takes the English crown. Well, William doesn't like that, so William sticks his men on his ships. He invades England. He kills and defeats Harold in the Battle of Hastings, and that happens in 1066. Okay, the Battle of Hastings, and he assumes control, and he is now king over all of England. Okay, he is now king. Oops, wrong country. There we go. He's now king over all of England. Now, this map, by the year 1066, it does not exist anymore. Now, he is just the king of all of it. Okay, he is the king of England. Okay, what's interesting is that the current queen, Queen Elizabeth II, can trace her lineage through various bloodlines all the way back to William the Conqueror. It's incredible. The British nobility is I believe, one of, if not the oldest, direct lines of monarchy. It's been with the same group of people through various houses, various families, for 1,000 years, since 1066, since William the Conqueror took over England. What does he do? Okay, so he is, remember, he is a descendant of these Vikings who settled in northern France. The very word Normandy comes from the word Norman, Norman, and Norman is a French English variation of the word Northman. Okay, so William Conqueror's his ancestors were Vikings that were settled there. Okay, so what does he do? He immediately gets to work settling this new kingdom of his, consolidating power. He's not going to run it like it has been run. There's not a bunch of different kingdoms. He's like, I am the king of this island of England. Okay, and first things first. One thing that he does do, one of the things that seems synonymous with the Middle Ages is a castle. Okay, is a castle. But before William, there were no castles built in England, because castles, to a large degree, were a French thing. They were built in France. And then this stronghold slowly started to spread throughout the rest of Europe. And the French, the people call themselves French, were very good at them. And so what does he do? He brings this concept over there as well. A castle is, at that time, and it still is, even though there's no reason to have them now, except as tourist attractions. But a castle is built for one purpose alone, and that is to house soldiers and house arms and to intimidate. Okay, that is the whole point of building a castle, because at this time castles are extremely expensive. Okay, you've got to call in a ton of craftsmen and laborers to build a castle. It takes a long time to build a castle, anywhere from 5 to 20 years, depending on how big it is. And so it has to be placed at a strategic point that it is going to control the surrounding countryside for dozens and dozens of miles. It's a place where troops are stationed and where troops can make forays out, okay, for the king. But it is a place of intimidation. It is this, it doesn't matter, what the castle looks like. The presence of it there, William understands, and his ministers understand, his advisors understand, that this is, he has to subject the people to his authority, okay? And he does for the first 5 or 6 years of his reign as the first king of England. He has to put down rebellions and everything else. He has to subject the people, let them know there's no if and buts about this. I am the king. I am in charge. Okay, and so we start to see underneath him this consolidation, right, under a central authority. He is the power in the land. He has nobles underneath him, but they don't just get to decide what they want to do. He decides what happens, and then they say, okay, yes, your majesty, we understand. So one of the first things that he does is he starts building castles, right? Number two, he sends out his tax collectors all over the place, because remember, we've been talking about this for thousands of years now at this point. One of the first things you need to do is collect money, okay? Running a kingdom or running an empire costs money. You need money for everything. Upkeep, you need money for roads, you need money for soldiers, everything else. So one of the very first things that he does after he builds the castles is he sends out his tax collectors along with other groups of men, and he gives them orders. He says, I want you to go to, I don't care how small the little hamlet, the little village is, I want you to go in there. I want you to record every single person that lives there, from the guy who has, his own home, to the guy who has who's laying in the street, okay? The old bum laying in the street. I want you to record everything that you know that you can find out about these people. And most importantly, I want you to write down how much they are worth. I want you to tell me how much they are worth. Now, why did he do this? Well, he did this just the same reason that the Roman emperors did this as well too, right? This was a census. He wanted to find out how many people were in his kingdom, who they were, and what were they capable of. How many fighting men did he have? So if he had to call together men, how many fighting men, of good standing age, did he have? But most importantly, who were these people and how much money could they give him? How much could he tax somebody? If a village had little to no means of income, he understood, I can't sit there and smash a huge amount of tax on them because there's no point. They can't give it to me. But if there's a certain area that is rich with like trade or whatever it might be, we can do that as well, okay? And so this is called, and you can still go read it now. It's a huge, giant book. It's really incredible. It's 1,000 years old. It's called the Domesday Book, okay? The Domesday Book, you can still see, like even today, you can see all these regular people that were tabulated on the rosters about who had what, who owned what. Okay. Number 3, he established new lords, right? So everybody that supported him, that came over with him, well, he gave them chunks of land, and he gave them new titles, right? The Duke of whatever, the Earl of whatever. And even the ones that supported him or sided with him that were already there, that went against Godwinson, he helped them as well too. Basically, it's like, thank you for helping me out, and here's your reward, okay? So by doing this, he approved that loyalty to the king was an important step in having this kingdom, okay? What's interesting about because we're talking about the year 1066 about William, is that he did not speak English at all. The English language in the year 1066 was what we would consider Old English. Okay, there's been 3 different incarnations of English throughout the ages. There's Old English, which is what the people, the Anglo-Saxons first started speaking. But if I took you back in that time, you would maybe recognize 1 out of every 50, 60 words, okay? You'd be speaking modern English, okay? And that's the 3rd one. And in the middle, you have Middle English. We don't start seeing the English language as we recognize it until around the 1600s, okay? 1500s, around the time of like Shakespeare. In William's time, you have Old English. And so it's a mixture of the Germanic, from when they brought over their language from northern Germany and the Low Countries. It's a mixture of just what they've come up with over the hundreds of years that they've been there since the Romans were gone. There's even some old Latin words that are still floating around there too, from way before, with the times of the Romans. And so William, he speaks his mixture of what French sounded like at that time. Okay, all business transactions, higher business transactions, and the language at court in London is done in French. Is done in French, and so if you want to get anywhere in life, you have to learn it. But as we've seen, when you stick 2 cultures together, what do? They start mixing, and they start matching, and they start blending together. And so our own modern English language is a hodgepodge of this as well. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of French words that have come into our lexicon as English speakers from this time period. For instance, like the word pioneer, or coupon, or dentiste, or dentist, pork, all these words that we take, that are English words, they originally came from the French, okay? So mixing them together, right, we start to see this new identity, right, of this Englishness that's there already, and this Frenchness, and then together they're going to be English, okay? Let's see what else. And so that's, so there we go with that. Okay, let me double check, make sure everything's good on the video camera. Yes, it is. Okay, very good. All right, moving on really quickly. So, one of the first actual centralized kingdoms in Europe is in England. Okay? Okay. Since William came from France, we also see the beginnings of the battles and fights that are going to be taking place between England and France for the next hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They're going to be fighting very off and on against one another over land and old ancient titles and everything else. So this is where we first get that mixture. Okay. All right. But speaking of that, moving on, we make it to the formation of France. So we've been focusing on France a lot, but before it was France, remember, it was Francia, right? Give its name given to it by the prominent tribe that settled there, the Franks. We see the rise of the Merovingian Empire, which gradually is displaced by the Carolingian Empire, and eventually that transforms the Holy Roman Empire. But by the time we get to the year 1000, the Holy Roman Empire has started to switch, and it's moved over geographically to Central Europe, and really focusing on northern Italy and Germany. And France starts to come into its own. Okay, France starts to come into its own. So if I took you back to around the year 1000, this is what France would look like. Okay, it gets much more wide as time moves on. But remember, there's where William the Conqueror launches his invasion from Normandy, and this is what France would look like. Now, as you can see here, the capital is up here, has been moved finally by the year 1000. The capital has finally been moved to the city of Paris. Okay, but remember, the king is well, those Carolingian kings start getting weak, and nobody's paying attention to them. Who are the people paying attention to? They're paying attention to the lords, the high lords that are in charge of the area where you live. And France is split up into these various dukedoms, okay, or duchies, all around. Okay, one of the biggest ones down here, we're going to be talking about this more later on, is the Duchy of Aquitaine or Aquitaine. Okay, but we have them all over the place. Okay, Duchy of Normandy, Duchy of Bretagne, Duchy of Toulouse, and so on. Okay, now remember, as we've talked about, the king, as time goes on, the king starts out kind of as a figurehead, but then as time goes on, he starts to gain more and more power. Okay, where does the beginning of France as France really happen? I would put it. I put it back to around the year 800 or so, moving it in the 900s, so about a century before we get to the year 1000. And what is happening? Well, remember, we have the invasions of the Vikings. The Vikings are hammering these cities and everything else in these areas all around. And remember, like we talked about with the Vikings, you are not safe being in the middle of the country, because those Viking ships can go all the way up into the heartlands there. And so the Vikings understand that if they go up the Seine River, they will eventually get to the city of Paris. And Paris, by the year 900 or 800, is starting to become a major trading center. It's starting to become a major place for commerce. There's a lot of people who live there. But they have these big city walls, and that's one thing that the Vikings were never good at, is taking cities. They were good at hit and run tactics, right? And wiping out, armies on the field. But they were not very good at taking big walled cities. So eventually what happens is that a little bit before the year 1000, these Vikings are attacking again, and they've come in force this time. Up to the walls of Paris, right up there along the Seine River. And they brought over 4,000 Vikings, which is a huge number at the time. It's a small army. And the poor people in Paris are trapped behind the city walls, and they're fighting off these Vikings as well as they can. And they send word off to the Carolingian king, basically saying, hey, come help us, right? But as we've talked about, the Carolingian king, no king has any standing armies, no such thing. So what does the Carolingian king have to do? Well, he has to call out his other lords and say, hey, I need your help to go help the grand city of Paris. And that takes time. It takes many, many weeks. Okay, it's not like they're just ready to go and they go up there and they're there in 2 days. It takes a long time. And then plus the Carolingian king at the time, I don't even remember his name because it doesn't matter. He's a ditherer. He's not doing anything. You know, he takes him a long time. And these people are getting frustrated and getting upset because they know that if these Vikings get in the city walls, that's going to be the end. They're going to get sent off to slavery. Their whole lives are going to be destroyed. And so they turn to two different guys. One is the local bishop, okay, for the church, for the Roman Catholic Church. His name is Odo, O-D-O. And the other person that they turn to is a local lord, and his name is Hugh Capet. I love some of these names, sound so modern. Okay, so Hugh Capet, that's his name. And Capet actually means, head. And he's a local lord, and he basically runs the show. He gets his men together, they fight off the Viking attacks, and eventually they run the Vikings off. The Vikings can't get past the city walls and everything else. And so what do the people do? They're like, well, this king that we have, he's a bum, he's a nobody, he didn't help us at all. And they turn their attention to Hugh Capet. And so we see the rise of the House of Capet. Now, when I say house, I mean a royal family. Okay. Royal families in Europe are formed in what's called a house. Okay. And think about a house as a tree, right? So the house would be the main trunk of the tree. That is the main family that starts, this power. Okay, and then as they go off and they marry into other families and start their own families, those are like the branches and leaves and smaller branches off of the tree as well. But that main house is the main trunk of the tree. Okay, and this is how it still is in Europe. All right, you still have royal families that are known by their names of a house. Okay, so for instance, like Queen Elizabeth, she is from the House of Windsor. Okay, W-I-N-D-S-O-R, the House of Windsor. And there's the houses of all these different people. The House of Capet is going to be in charge of France now from here, from the end of the 10th century, so the 900s, all the way up until the very last French king in the early 1800s. So they're going to be in charge of France through various houses for the next 800 years. Okay, and this is once again just like we see with the English. We're slowly starting to see the formation of France. Okay, the kingdom of France, led by this house, and centered in Paris, and slowly. This house and the kings of France are going to start pushing out their feelers. They're going to start pushing out for more power around France itself. Okay. And then also one of the other things in France at this time is that these rulers, these kings, are elected. Now that's at the very beginning. They're elected by the nobles, basically put into place there, but it's a given. If you're the king of France, and you have a son, the prince, or in French, the dauphin, he's going to be the next king. He's going to be voted on. He's going to be the next king. Eventually, that whole concept goes away too, and now it's just you have the king, you have the prince, king, prince, so on. Okay, but that is France in a nutshell in the High Middle Ages. All right. Moving on to this next group, we talked about Spain, or the modern word Spain, earlier when we talked about the invasion of the Muslim armies. Okay, the invasion of the Muslim armies in the 700s, they wipe out the Christian kingdoms there. The old barbarian kingdoms get wiped out there, and all of this. In the year 1000 is all belongs to the different caliphates. right? The different caliphates that stretch all across northern Africa, all the way back to the Levant, okay? Egypt and the Holy Land. And this is as far as they get. Eventually, the border just slowly starts to settle in, and these are all Christian kingdoms that have carved out their own little existences here. So like we have the Kingdom of Leon, the Kingdom of Castile, Basque Kingdom of Navarre, and so on. Now remember, they tried pushing up into France in the 700s. Charles Martel stopped them, and they eventually pulled back and started consolidating around here. Now, Spain at this time is a little bit, well, it's a lot of it interesting, as a matter of fact, because of how life was in Spain at this time. This is very strange. From the year 800 to the year 1491, we have in Spain what's called the Reconquista, which means the reconquest. So basically, these Christian rulers and these tiny little kingdoms up there are focusing on picking away at this Muslim empire that's in Europe, because this is as far as the Muslims have got, these caliphates have got in Europe proper. And even as far back as the year 800, like when Charlemagne is crowned Holy Roman Emperor, these little Christian kingdoms are slowly starting to eat away and take back territory. And this process, the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Spain, will take, as you can see, almost 700 years. But by the year 1491, the final place in Spain, okay, Malaga down here, will be taken over 1 year before Christopher Columbus sets sail to the New World. It takes 600 years, or 700 years, but they do it, okay? They slowly start chipping away at it. But we're gonna focus right now on this area instead of this, because this is just like anything else, okay? Up in Europe, or excuse me, France and England. These are all Christian kingdoms, but we're gonna focus on this area here because it's very interesting. Remember, Spain is one of the few places in Europe at this time where you have a mixture of religions, of the three major religions in Europe at this time, okay? So remember, this is called, by the Muslim word for Spain, Al-Andalus. Okay, and you have in Al-Andalus, you have really the only place in Europe, you have a mixture and large concentrations of all three of the of the Abrahamic religions, okay? You have Christianity, obviously. You have Muslims, obviously, because they're in charge. And then you have the Jewish populations, okay? Does that mean that there weren't any Muslims or Jews in other parts in Europe? Of course there were, but in very, very, very small numbers, okay? And you still had Christians in Al-Andalus, because it's not like when the Muslims got there, they just performed ethnic cleansing and started getting rid of every Christian. That would be pointless. So there's still plenty of Christians there. But in Al-Andalus, in Spain here, you start to see the beginning of the only time that this ever happens in Europe. And this is a very interesting thing where you have a an instance where you have all three of these groups, these religious groups, living together in relative peace, okay? Because they're everywhere. Like, there's different quarters of the cities. You know, I mean, all the people in charge are Muslim. And if you want to become a person in charge, you have to convert to Islam. That hasn't changed. And the Muslims are still taxing non-believers. They're still taxing non-believers. So if you want to still worship Christ, or if you want to be part of the Jewish faith, you still have to pay a penalty, a tax, to the Muslim overlord, whoever is there. Okay, but that's really as far as it goes. These people live amongst one another in these cities. It's impossible not to have that. The only separation you have really is of the Jewish populations. The Jews in these Spanish cities are confined to their own quarters of the city. Okay, they're confined to their own quarters of the city. That is called the ghetto, Ghetto. Okay, this is their own, has nothing to do with poverty, has nothing to do with anything like that. It's just that this is where this Jewish population is usually confined to a certain part of the city that houses all three: Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Okay, and they just kind of get along. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand me and think, oh wow, these guys were living in a totally utopian progressive society way back 1,000 years ago. That is not the case. It would still, like, if we look at it from our perspective, it would still be considered a very brutal society. And there were still major limitations and still major rules on what you could and couldn't do in this area. So for instance, once again, if you were not a Muslim, if you were a Christian or a Jew, you could not be a member of you could not be a ruler, you could not be in charge, you could not be a member of the government. It did not mean that they did not have these people there as advisors, but you could not move up. You could not be appointed to to a place to be like a Lord Mayor or something like that. Okay, it just didn't happen. Also, you didn't have intermingling, as in, like, you didn't have mixed marriages. Like a Christian couldn't marry a Muslim girl, or a Jewish man couldn't marry a Christian girl, or whatever it might be. It just, if that was found out to have happened, you couldn't have sexual relations with one another. If that was found out, both parties were, well, usually the man, but in some instances the woman, were put to death. You could not do that. Okay, just did not happen. However, to a large degree, what develops here, let me get the order, make sure I write down correctly, is this. There we go. Yeah. The Spanish word is called convivencia. Okay, convivencia can be loosely translated to coexistence. And we see a little bit of that here. So basically, these three groups living in such close proximity to each other and in such large numbers realize, just kind of develop an understanding without really talking about it, that you can't just be killing and slaughtering each other over and over again, that nothing will happen in society, and that people learn to just deal with each other. And that's what we have in Spain at this time. It's called convivencia, or coexistence. Like I said, there are still major rules and stipulations that you cannot cross. So for instance, if you were a Muslim and you were found to have converted to Christianity, you could be killed. You could be brought before the local magistrates and you could be killed. It didn't work that way the other way, as in, if a Muslim wanted to convert to Christianity, then he was accepted with open arms. But we have what's called a convivencia and a coexistence. Now, why were there so many Jewish people living there? There were so many Jewish people living there because elsewhere in Europe, they were treated like dirt. In places like France, especially, England, there's a little bit more of toleration for them, but especially in France, the Jewish populations were always very small, and they were always picked on to a large degree. There was anti-Semitism was rampant throughout Europe throughout the Middle Ages, in most places. The Jews were routinely, their places where they would be stuck in their towns. They would be, people would go through, Christians would go through and ransack that place. They would beat these people and everything else. So over time, over generations, many Jewish families immigrated to Al-Andalus, to Spain, and they actually had the most progressive lives that they could possibly have in the year 1000 or 1100 or 1200, whatever it might be, because the Muslims did not have such a great hatred for the Jewish populations as the Christians did. The Christians always looked at the Muslim population, or excuse me, the Jewish populations as in, you guys were the killers of Christ, and so for that you'll always be punished for that. You can never be redeemed for that. Okay, but once again, this isn't some grand utopia, but in the context of the Middle Ages, this is pretty amazing how these people were able to, and it showed that it could happen. Now, did it mean that people weren't being killed? Yeah, people were still being killed, but it could happen at that time. It just only happened there, okay? All right, so moving on really quickly. All right, we moved to here. Italy, as the country of Italy, is so extremely modern. We're not even going to talk about it in this class. That does not happen until like the 1860s, 1870s. But remember, we're talking about the concept of identity, okay? So if you're living in what we know as Italy, the boot of Europe now at this point, the year 1000, this is what the map looks like. You have a little kingdom still up there. You have the Holy Roman, or excuse me, you have the Papal States, right, where the Pope lives, right here in Rome, and you have these other different duchies and stuff like that. But for the most part, once again, just like anybody else, the Italians are not different from anybody else. They are slowly starting to develop this identity. They realize that the way they do things, the way they dress, the way they talk is different than the French or the English or the Spanish or whatever it might be, okay? They do have one thing in common, just like they all do, remember, is Christianity. But this is a time period where geography makes a difference. So like in any of these places, how it is in the south is different than how it is in the north, okay? And also, when it comes to Italy, it's also an ethnic distinction as well, too. And that's how it is now, when you go to Italy now. The people in the south are a lot more rural, for a large part, especially like in Sicily, things like that. Much more rural, farmers, poor, darker skin, darker hair. And then if you go up to the north, you start to see that mixture of like the German as well. So all of a sudden you see Italians that are speaking Italian, but they have blonde hair, blue eyes, they have German surnames as opposed to Italian surnames. And this area here is slowly developing into a more urban population center. A lot of population, and they're not really out in the fields. They're in the cities, okay? And we're gonna be talking about those cities because they're very, very important. The two biggest ones obviously are Genoa and Venice. We've talked about Venice before, but we're gonna keep talking about them as well, okay? All right, where are we? Really quickly before we move on, with Rome, right, here's Rome, the eternal city, and it is the place where the Pope resides, and he's been sitting there at this point for 700 years doing his thing. Over time, by the year 1000, we see the spread of papal influence, or the Pope's influence, regionally. So this area here actually becomes part of direct land that the papacy, the Pope, controls, and they're called the Papal States, P-A-P-A-L, states, okay? Don't get them confused with states like, Nevada or California, but it is now a political entity, okay? It's not just a religious one, it's now a political entity as well. And the Pope rules over those Papal States, we're gonna talk about this next week too, as if he were a king, okay? As if he were a king over this area. So anybody who lives there, they have owe their allegiance directly to the Pope himself, okay, in Rome. But Italy, as we know it, it's still got a long ways to go before it can be considered Italy. Okay, right now it's just this hodgepodge of all of these kingdoms and dukedoms and things like that. Okay. All right. Moving on. Where are we at? All right, so the creation of the Holy Roman Empire begins in the year 800, right, when Charlemagne is crowned. Culturally, culturally, this eventually starts becoming what we see on the map, which is German, okay? And remember, one of remember you have Charlemagne, then you have his son Louis the Pious. One of his children is another guy called Louis the German, okay? So like Louis II. And he calls himself the German because the area of the Carolingian Empire that he takes over, the Holy Roman Empire, is centered here in Germany. Now, once again, the idea of Germany as a country is so very new that, once again, we won't be talking about it in the context of this class. However, even going back as far as the High Middle Ages, there is a distinction already beginning with that identity that the people over here understand themselves as being different than the people over here, okay? You start to hear the word German, and that is not a new word. We've seen that word before, going all the way back to the ancient Romans. They even called this area here, based off the old tribes, Germania, right? Germania, or the land of the Germans, okay? But this is what the Holy Roman Empire now looks like around the year 1000. It's a giant mess, okay? Giant mess. Inside of this Holy Roman Empire is duchies and kingdoms and counties and free cities and independent cities and all this other stuff, okay? All smashed into this area, okay? All smashed into this area. The capital, the imperial capital is still here in Aachen, okay? Which is now in the Low Countries, but then it was in this Holy Roman German area. And this is also an interesting thing, and this is something that continues on for the next 1,000 years, is that the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, he is crowned by the Pope, obviously, just like Charlemagne was, but he is also elected, just like we talked about the French at the very beginning. But unlike the French, who eventually just becomes primogeniture, remember that word, that vocab word from last week, where the first son becomes the prince, and then he'll be the next king. The same thing happens in the Holy Roman Empire, but to a larger degree. All of these groups here have a leader. So like here's the Kingdom of Burgundy, you have a king of Burgundy, okay? And the king of Burgundy owes his allegiance to the emperor. Same thing, wherever it might be, the Duchy of Bavaria, okay? The Duke, whatever. When the emperor dies, all of these groups come together, these leaders come together, and they vote on who will be the next Holy Roman Emperor, okay? As we've seen, 99.9% of the time, they vote for the son of the previous emperor. But every once in a while, it doesn't go that way, and you get infighting and civil wars. But for the most part, that's what happens. So, but the idea is still there, that they're still voting, that this isn't just strictly based on birthright, okay? But it does happen that this is... Hey, how's it going? And my dog decided to step in and see how things are going. So anyway, this is what it looks like around the year 1000, okay? All right, so, who's this stern looking guy? This guy's name, year 1000, let's see. Get rid of some of this. His name, we see in Rise of a New Emperor, and his name is, he's got a good German name, Otto, O-T-T-O, Otto the Great. There he is with his beautiful, luscious locks, okay? What he does, why he's called the Great, is because the Holy Roman Empire is, well, it's kind of a big mess after the Carolingians are gone for the most part, okay? So it's not this nice unified thing underneath Charlemagne. You now have this, kind of hodgepodge of all these groups doing their thing, okay? But Otto, around the year 1000, he puts an end to that. He puts down all these civil wars, he puts down all these rebellions, and he solidifies the role of the emperor. Okay, he solidifies the role of the emperor as I am the Holy Roman Emperor. I am in charge. The power comes from me. And yes, you are the Duke of whatever, and you're the king of whatever, but you owe your fealty, you owe your allegiance to who? To me. I am the guy. Okay, I'm the one who you guys have chosen to be in charge. I am the son of this person, and I am the one who's going to take control. And so he's called Otto the Great because, like all great leaders, he was able to fight off his enemies. He was able to consolidate his power. He was able to institute reforms in the HRE, the Holy Roman Empire, and he was able to make it powerful again, since it had started kind of going downhill a little bit. When he died, he had a son, and the son's name was Otto II, O-T-T-O, the second. Otto II continued in the footsteps of his father, and kept consolidating power and putting power tighter under the imperial grasp. And I'll give you 3 guesses what his son was called. All right. So Otto the First, or Otto the Great, Otto the Second, Otto the Third, and together these three men were called the Ottonian dynasty, right? Because they're all from one house, and this house retains control over the whole empire for many, many years. Okay, until eventually you get to a Otto who's not so great, or a family member who's not so great, and another royal family takes over power over the Holy Roman Empire. But while these guys were in charge, the Holy Roman Empire became, powerful again, very powerful, to the point where it was a dominant force in European politics. Okay, both militaristically, economically, culturally, a lot. Okay. Because, as you can see, it stretches all the way up from modern day Denmark, all the way down to the south in central Italy. So there's a huge amount of cultural differences in this empire. So keeping them together is very difficult because you have different languages being spoken, you have different customs being done, everything else. Once again, the only thing that keeps these people together is the Christian tradition, right? That they are all Christians, okay? And they are all living lives, basically, while things are varying in their lives, how they speak, but a peasant is a peasant, no matter where they are. So that's how it goes. All right, so here's Otto II, here's his son, and then we have Otto III. Okay, all right. And once again, and this leads us into our next thing, what are you noticing? So not with Otto the First. He's got his crown, he's on horseback. This is kind of a militaristic pose. But what do you see with his son, right? He's holding his scepter, right? And this is a theme that we've talked about a lot, going all the way back to the ancient Romans. He's got his scepter in one hand, which symbolizes his authority as king, as emperor. His authority he's in charge of the military, okay? He's the head guy, the head general, whatever you want to call him. But in his left hand, he's holding what? He's holding that orb, right? And on that orb is the crucifix. On that orb is the sign of the cross, which is different from the ancient Romans because he's showing, yes, I am in charge of whatever it is I'm in charge of, an empire or a king or whatever, or a kingdom, whatever. But I do it in conjunction with the Holy Church, okay? So with the ancient Romans, remember you had auspicium and imperium, right? The right to lead the armies, but also the right and ability to converse with the gods. Now it's just been switched. So now you have still the right and authority of being king or emperor, but then you also have the authority that you're doing this under the view of God, that you are the reason, he is the reason why you're here. You've been ordained by God. The whole reason you came around, your birth, is because of the intervention by God. He wanted you here. It's your divine right to be in charge of this group of people. Okay? All right. Excuse me. Okay, you guys saw this little drawing last week, because remember we were talking about the Middle Ages was a pretty brutal time period, right? And it lasted away for a very long time. Now, why is it so brutal? Well, it's brutal because there's no central enforcement, right? There's no central authority. Like in a modern world, people know not to do something bad because they're going to be punished. There's going to be authority figures there very quickly, and they're going to be punished by the law. Now, the law only has power because the people have granted it power. Okay, through whatever form of government that it might be. Well, that's a very modern concept. In the Middle Ages, the only power was basically through force. You had power because you were able to enforce your demands, right? If you were the local lord, the people only listened to you because they listened to you for a couple reasons. They listened to you because was tradition. Their parents listened to your parents, their grandparents listened to your grandparents, and so on, because you were a different hierarchy than them, right? You were part of a different level of the hierarchy, right? So they listened to you because of your title and because of the power that you wielded and influenced. But they also listened to you because of sheer force. That if you demand something, you will get it or else. And there's always that threat. And that threat always comes down to violence, okay? If you're a peasant living on some, baron's land or count's land or something like that, the threat is not necessarily violence, but it's violence against your family, okay? As in, not like the Lord's gonna come and, kill you all there in your homes if you don't pay him taxes or you don't pay him, 80% of the harvest. But he's basically going to kick you off because you're just renting from him. You don't actually own the land or anything on the land. He's letting you work for him. And so there's always that threat of violence to your what? To your livelihood, to your life. That if, you've sat there and you've raised this crop for a long time, and now you don't have it anymore because the Lord kicked you off the land, well, you and your family are not going to last the winter. It's just not going to happen. But then there is also still the threat of violence, okay, throughout society, that might makes right, and that the strongest person is the person that can throw their weight around and do what they want over smaller, weaker people. And we saw a little bit of that starting to change last week when we talked about the truce and the pact of God, okay? But then we get something a little bit new as well, too. By the year 1000, the Catholic Church, right, the Holy Mother Church in Rome, is the undisputed spiritual leader in Europe. There's no other set religious places. There's no such thing as any other types of religion. There might be people who believe in a little bit of old paganism, or they believe in Christianity in their way. But these people are very, very few and far between, and the church roots them out quickly. If you, because one person, who cares? But if two people start listening to that one person, that's still not really cause for concern. But all of a sudden, if more and more people start listening to you, that means that now you have a fight on your hands. Because that means if they're listening to this person say how they think God is, or that the teachings of the church are incorrect, that turns into a problem. So they quash that as quickly as they can. If there's rumors about somebody, running around saying heretical thought or beliefs, they they stop that. They nip that in the bud very, very quickly. Okay. However, even the church itself was not immune to corruption and all the other things, problems, vices of power. When you grant an institution or you grant a person almost unlimited power, well, some people do good with it and other people don't. Okay, check, make sure everything's good to go. Yeah. Okay. So what we get is okay. Around the 900s, leading up, and this is leading up into the year 1000, we start to see what's called the Reform of Cluny, C-L-U-N-Y, okay? Cluny is down here in southern France, in the Dukedom of Aquitaine, okay? And what happens is in the year 910, there's the Duke, his name is William, Duke William of Aquitaine, and what he does is when he dies, he bequeaths a bunch of land and, a bunch of land and buildings to the church, okay? This is where we see, and then they form what's called the Abbey of Cluny, okay? So an abbey is a building, a specific building, and it's part of the institution of the church. So not only is it a place for church, leaders like monks and priests and bishops to go to hold their their talks about religion, but it's also a place that they own specifically. Okay, they grow things on it, they raise livestock on it. It's like its own little town. Okay, right there in the middle of France, and they're all over the place, all throughout Europe. Okay, so he does that, and what these church fathers do is instead of focusing on the people like they did with the Truce and Pact of God, some of them start focusing on themselves, okay? This is very, very important. They start focusing on themselves because, like I said, when you grant an institution so much power, eventually it's going to go to the heads of some people, and bad traditions and bad things are going to get started that are just going to keep going and going and going. And the church, even though they're the church, they're no different. And so there's many church leaders and fathers who look around the church and say, I think we're getting kind of a little out of control here. I think that many in the church are, they're saying to themselves, I think that many in the church are not doing what they were expected to do. You give your life to the church. Basically, you give your life to Christ. The idea is that you're going to you're going to teach, you're going to proselytize about the word of Christ, you're going to teach regular people, you're going to administer to the people's needs, their spiritual needs, and you're going to help people. Well, the more power you give people, they start to forget about those conditions, and they just start enjoying the power. And so the Reform of Cluny is this movement that gets started in the High Middle Ages, where these church fathers are looking in on themselves and admonishing each other and saying, what are we truly doing? What are these problems that have crept up here, that have now gone for a long time, and how can we stop them, or at least mitigate the problems that are arising from them, okay? So I'm going to give you a list, see if I can find it. of these problems. Okay, where'd it go? There you go. Got it somewhere here. I know I do. Oops, my little thing just went off. Ah, there it is. Okay. Let me turn this off really quick. So we're going to wrap up with this. And then that'll be the end of part one. Okay, so what are these problems that the church is facing really quickly? Because we're going to talk about these again, because these are going to keep creeping up for the next 500 years of the Roman Catholic Church, okay? It's not like they just started at this time period, but they do keep going, okay? All right, so number one. So the problems of the church. So remember, folks, when I say the church, I'm not talking about any other, there's no such thing as any other churches. Remember, I hate to keep belaboring this point, but I want to make sure there's no confusion with this. We're talking about the Roman Catholic Church, because that's the only church in town, okay? All right, so number one is the concept of simony, okay? And simony is the selling of church offices to the highest bidder. All right, so this is crazy. So the word is simony, S-I-M-O-N-Y, and this is the selling of church offices to the highest bidder. Remember we talked about the idea of primogeniture, right? So a guy would have, he'd be a noble, whatever. He would have his, let's say, 3 sons. Well, the first son, based on primogeniture, the first son is going to inherit everything, right? He's going to be the next duke or whatever it might be. He's going to get all the land, he's going to get all the money, everything. Well, what happens to the second and third son? The second son, it's a trade-off. The second son can either do a religious route or a military route. At this time, military is really hand in hand with, primogeniture. But if you have a son and you don't know what to do with him, what a common concept at this time was that you would go to the church and say, look, I've got this son, I need something for him to do, I need him to make a living. So you'd basically volunteer him for the church. He would be in the church now, but he's the son of a lord, so he's not just going to be some regular priest in some little, no-name little village. You want him to be a high-level member of the church. So basically, simony is you go to, a high-ranking official in the Catholic Church, like a cardinal, or even up to the top, the Pope himself. You pay him X amount of gold, and then he finds a position for your son. Okay, that person has now been granted the title of whatever it might be. Well, this is a major problem, because all of a sudden you have a 19-year-old kid who doesn't really know much, and all of a sudden he's now been granted a cardinalship, one of the highest ranking offices in the church, or he's now made bishop. And why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem for a lot of reasons. Number one, it might not even be his true calling. He's just there because that's what daddy wanted. Number two, he doesn't know how to do the office as well. He doesn't know how to be a priest. He hasn't gone to school. He hasn't learned how to be a priest. All of a sudden, just by sticking a bunch of fancy clothes on him doesn't turn him into a priest or a cardinal, whatever it might be. He doesn't know how to do the things that need to be done to hear confession, all that stuff, okay? And he's a young person. And number three, it portrays the church as basically a business. They're selling different positions in the church. They're not granting them to people that know what they're doing. They're just giving the positions to the highest bidder, the person that can afford to pay the most money. Okay? And this is a big no-no. This is a big no-no, but the church has been doing it for a long time. So the Reformed Cluny tries to fix that. Okay? Number two is the concept of usury. USURY. That is high interest loans, okay? Now, the church has had a crazy, by the time you get to the Middle Ages, the church has had kind of a weird relationship with loaning money, okay? Loaning money is as old as time itself. Somebody doesn't have money, so they come to you and you have money and you give them X amount of money and then they have to pay you back. Well, according to ancient church teachings, it was based on charity. So like if your fellow man didn't have any money and he needed money to pay the rent or something like that, you would just give him the money either as a charity, like just here you go, man, and he would take the money, or basically just pay it back. That's fine. Give me back the money when you have it. But usury is the idea that, as people figured this out pretty quickly, that if I have enough money, I can give somebody a loan and I can make money off that loan, right? I can charge them for the benefit of me having the money and them not having the money. So not only do they have to pay me back the money that I loan them, they have to pay me back money that they accrue, a charge, right? Every week or every month or whatever, until they can pay me back. In many cases, they're indebted to me forever because they cannot get to that point where they're now out of debt to me. They are always owing me money because they can never pay it back based on the time allotted. This was a big no-no, but it was also something that was, routinely ignored, not only in the church, but throughout society. There was no laws against it, right? There was nothing saying you couldn't do it. But when the church got involved, the church turned almost into bankers. Basically, people could come because who had a ton of money? The church. Hey, priest, I need some money. Okay, instead of the priest just giving it to his charity, he'd be like, here you go. Now you owe me whatever, 1% by next week if you don't pay it back. Well, and that enriched a lot of these people. And this was a huge no-no, okay? And then this one, celibacy. This is a big one that was routinely ignored by church fathers, by the men. Celibacy. Early on in the church teachings, the idea was that, by the year 800, 900, that if you were a priest, that was it. When it came to sex or sexual gratification or having children or anything like that, you were to remain celibate. You were not to masturbate. You were not to visit brothels. You were not to do anything like that. Your life was now dedicated to Christ. And same thing for the women, for the nuns. You were basically married to Christ. You were married to the church. If you didn't like that, then you had to leave the church. But while you were a member of the church, it was expected that you would remain celibate, that you want to do this. Well, once again, if you have a person that has been granted a ton of power, a ton of money, everything else, this starts to go away pretty quickly, okay? So it is commonplace in this time period that you have a bishop that he's running around with his fancy robes on. He's covered in gold, he's covered in velvet, he's covered in all the stuff that a million other people couldn't even possibly dream of affording, and he's got mistresses. There are many, many, many documented cases in the sources of various cardinals, even the popes, that have marriages and they have children, illegitimate children. They have girlfriends, they have mistresses, they have whatever, and they're using their money to pay these girls off. They're visiting brothels, and this is not every one of them. Not once again, this is not on anything. This is not all or nothing. There are many, many. The vast majority of church officials are doing what they're supposed to be doing, but then you have those people, especially the higher up ones, that are doing what they're not supposed to be doing. They're going against the rules of the church. And so this is a big one, okay? So celibacy, no sex, but we see that they're shying away from following that one. Okay, so we're gonna stop for right now, and then we'll pick it up in part 2, okay?